you want to jump in here? Because I think you're actually articulating two different versions of how we think about citizens, right? One is the citizen as consumer, and the other is sort of the governance, the policy aspects, where you're working in some of the work that you guys are doing to actually get the policies going. I mean, you're talking about cities across the country that do not have basic policies about open data. So before we can even get to the question of how you create the centralized platform, we have to think about the humans. And I think that's also Andrew's point about how we humanize this stuff.
Well,
so
it's basic
Zach,
capacity.
Laura, and then Andrew.
Right.
Yeah.
And as Andrew jumps in, I wouldn't say centralized is at all what I'm saying, but please.
Zach, do you want to?
No, well, I think it's basic capacity, and I'll just be quick. It's, one city that we were working with when we started with said, we began this sort of data inventory process, which is just, in essence, what do you have? Like, what exists in your city? They didn't, the quote was that we didn't even know where the data were. We have no idea what we have, what we collect on a day-to-day basis, right? That's a fundamental, point in doing anything that we're talking about is how can we begin to then once you then begin to inventory and put that out, you can begin to connect the dots. And figure out whether these issues are out there. So I think that that's a lot of folks want to get data out there for a hackathon or something that's going to produce something cool, right? Taking a step back from that and really studying fundamentals, how do we want to think about this? How do we want to use this the piece of information we collect on a day-to-day basis, and then what do we have, and then how can we make that actionable?
Right, and so Laura, to your point about centralization, so then if you have this and it's actionable, if it's not centralization, how do we think about it?
So I'm talking about how does it get financed?
Okay, that's
very
interesting.
There's a cost of even doing an inventory.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian is advocating, or maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'll just use you as a foil here.
Totally.
We could basically say the compilers and owners of this data are going to be private corporations. And the best that we can do is cut some deals for trading back and forth. But ultimately, the problem that they are always solving for is, in fact, how to maximize and monetize whatever expenditures they're making.
Welcome to America.
So if you can make the case that there is a bottom line benefit to them providing data and providing the services around data to not-for-profits, then that's potentially the paradigm of the future. But I would say that if we put all data and service first to how it can be monetized, and then secondarily to other things that are not questions that are measured by financial gain, I think that's a problem. And when you say centralized, I kind of
and I want to
recoil at
explore
that, because what we're talking about is there have been whether you call them utilities or national highway systems or reserving part of the communication bandwidth, there are investments that we as a society need to make in certain infrastructures that are not always completely defined by how quickly they can be monetized, that enable advancement to come on many levels and in many spheres of and where the costs of doing some of what we're all talking about have to be borne somewhere. We could leave it all in the private sector and allow it to be largely defined. It's a little bit like what we did when television and broadcast media became the means of communication in America, several decades ago. And that was largely left in private hands with a small slice of public television and public radio reserved for something else. And that has consequences in many different respects as folks who own the communications medium seek to drive the bottom line. That leads to a certain kind of journalism, that leads to a certain kind of entertainment, that leads to a certain kind of communication, it leads to certain kinds of access for different communities. All of those questions play out when a decision is made to allow a large, crucial part of infrastructure to be privatized. And often that creates a great deal more efficiency. But is efficiency always the question?
Let me clarify. I 100% agree with you.
We have to argue a little bit, so this will be dull.
But what I want to differentiate is the idea of privatizing versus letting the market drive it. And I don't mean the market as in capital M market. I mean the semi-enlightened self-interest of all Americans. There is a calculation that can be made as to what the value of sharing data would be. The government does it, corporations do it, nonprofits do it poorly. But the idea is that we have not established the value proposition for sharing data effectively writ large. Only the data people understand and appreciate what the potential could be. And by the way, I don't think we fully understand what the potential could be because we have a tiny sliver of what the data is that is available. So no, I don't want necessarily to give Axiom the keys to the kingdom, because, by the way, like, they're not great at all things data. They're best at the things that the market at its present, capital M market in its present case is most demanding of. At the same time, if you swing it all the way to the other end of the pendulum, the government is not particularly good at capitalizing on or responding to market forces. And so, the worst thing that would happen, right, is the slow and deliberate longitudinal focus on everything missing out on the opportunity. And I'll put the refugee crisis as a perfect example in here. The High Commissioner, who was at Georgetown about 2 weeks ago talking about this, basically said that the reason the refugee crisis in Europe is such a problem at the moment is because everyone was surprised that all of these people would all of a sudden start flooding out of Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and into Europe. Why were we surprised? We were surprised because the people who have the data on population movements and the drivers of displacement operate at the slow speed of thoughtful deliberation. And everyone else is looking at it and going, people moving, like, those people are fleeing, like, I don't know why, but I'm pretty sure, like, a boat overfilled with people is a problem. So the standardization of those two things allow those two forces to get there. I happen to have confidence, naive as it may be, that we as a society could balance capital M market and little m forces the same way you're looking at short-term data when clients come to you and say, I need something to win, CD4, and someone else saying, like, I'm trying to get more people in the country to care about gay marriage and support gay marriage, and I know that's going to take a decade because no rational argument seems to work, but I can soften the ground, and then I can do it, and then there'll be this, and then the courts, blah, blah, blah. And that will balance those two. I don't think the general population, and I say this because, like, we had a fight at dinner last night where some of the most sophisticated data people won't share their own personal data because they're like, I could be discriminated against. And I'm like, solve for the problem of that when we have that problem. Don't prevent us from solving the core problem because you're imagining something that is extraordinary way down the line. We don't even know what the problems are when we know all the data. We don't even have the starting point.
But I think part of the reason we see that is that there's a disconnect between people and the data. So Andrew, I want you to just chat a little bit about that, and then I'm going to open it up for questions about how you guys think about humanizing this data, which you guys effectively do very well, because people don't understand these kinds of conversations that we're having right now.
Yeah, so let me think of like a concrete example, and we could to discuss how you both humanize data and what good can that provide to spur social good, while also addressing this kind of debate we just had here about, like, what is the obstacle to using data for social good? Is it this private-public dispute or something else? So a concrete example, and I'm no expert, so this is purposely just like a model. Let's use the Affordable Care Act and the new data that's being rolled out by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies. Again, I'm not an expert in healthcare data, but one way to think of it is, okay, there's obviously a lot of private data from pharmaceutical companies, healthcare providers, personal medical records. That's not going to be publicly released anytime soon. Maybe some summary version of it could be, and that gets at this issue of is the problem that Cigna is not releasing certain information that would help some nonprofit better address healthcare issues. That's one example in this model of the Affordable Care Act. Another is, okay, so the CMS data is coming out. One way to use it, was to let's write a story on both, where are the uninsured in America and who are they? Are they who's falling through the gaps of the Affordable Care Act. Just as a kind of a very human, personal story, a lot of this kind of, ACA talk can get very abstract, and a lot of the data, especially on something as human as healthcare, can get very kind of disconnected and abstract as well. So we wrote a story about like what percentage of the uninsured are those that fall into the Medicaid gap? What percentage are immigrants, legal or illegal for whatever reason, that aren't signing up on the exchange or being provided for by Medicaid or Medicare, and so on. That was a very human story, and like telling it with graphics and reporting really kind of hooked a reader to kind of, oh, this is interesting. Let's use the CMS data to tell a larger story. But I think, so that addresses Hollie's question, and we can talk about this, but I think it also kind of talks to this issue of, okay, so what was the obstacle to using data to help either better implement the ACA or just solve the bigger problem of healthcare in America? What was the obstacle? Was it Cigna or other private companies not sharing their data? Maybe we can get some headway there, but like, Jesus Christ, the CMS had all this amazing data that they didn't even release until this year, and people could actually start writing stories off of it, not just from a journalism point of view, but nonprofits could use the data to target, oh, what county exactly has this higher than explained uninsurance rate? Why is it? Like, let's go outreach to those people. That's public data. It just wasn't in a usable form, or it wasn't really collected to begin with. And now as we see, the pressure, not just market forces, but the pressure for open data and disclosure is going to drive these questions. And I think the real obstacle is analysis and openness. And once you get the data open, and once you get a passion of either open source people or civic society groups to analyze it, that'll help solve a lot of the problems. Not to say that the public-private issues aren't there.
I actually think the problem is imagination. Like, I mean, Laura said it great. Like, do we know what problems we're solving for? We're still solving for the problems that we dreamed up 20 years ago, and now we just have better data to go and solve a lot of those problems. What's the next set of problems beyond those that are present in our current day, the predictive problems? Where's the next refugee crisis? Where's the population movement in the United States going to create the next gap in healthcare coverage or what have you? And what does that necessitate from a data standpoint? Because it would be really nice for a change, A, not only to solve problems, because we kind of are deficient in that, but actually to anticipate some of these problems and be prepared before they happen, so that we can, craft legislation or motivate, greater civic participation, or just be standing at the border with a blanket and a bottle of water when someone who has fled unspeakable violence, like, shows up, instead of being like, what do you need? Okay, that's gonna take like 3 days to get some water. But that's cool because like last time it took 5 days. So like we're getting better, but like, there are simple solutions to a lot of these problems, but we're literally, I think, using the data in many cases to solve problems in the past, not because of the availability of data, but because we lack the imagination to open up the conversation to the point where then we can push for data. Like, I don't know what data I need. Just give me all your freaking data, and I'll figure out what I'm trying to solve for later. Like, what's the incentive? Like, I don't know what the incentive is. The incentive is I'll figure it out later, and I'm pretty confident I'll find a way that it's going to benefit you as well. Like, I call that the imagination gap. Like, we have an imagination gap. If we close that gap, it's going to like unleash the forces of analysis and journalism and policy creation and political engagement and all things. We just like give us a chance to do what we're really good at and stop making these institutional barriers that exist. Like, dream it up and make it happen. I think that's what's
a perfect way to segue into opening up to you. So there are microphones there. Please introduce yourself. If you want to we could bring a microphone to you, and keep your questions and keep them brief, and then I'll direct different panelists to answer them.
Hilda Ochoa, Youth Orchestra of the Americas. I want to touch on the imagination gap. The problem with imagination gaps is that imaginations can run wild, and therefore, by definition, you're always going to have a gap in bringing it to reality, but that's the way to go. So on the issue of imagination gap, one of the most fertile, it's a question and a statement, one of the most fertile research efforts that could be put to work right now, and I'm going to touch upon the refugee crisis and what could we expect for the future, and longitudinal in population data in the United States is the aging of the US population. Those are going to be the massive refugees of the United States. They're aging at a very rapid pace, and that is going to create even more severe and predictable income disparities, because the moment somebody retires, their income drops to almost nothing. And there are no savings to protect these people, and there is not enough health care to help them. So one of the major lacks of data that exists right now is human capital data for countries. Countries measure income statements, flows of funds, but they do not measure their assets and liabilities. And of course, the major assets a country has, it's its human capital. Probably we inherited that from slavery. We don't want to measure human capital because it's not nice. So the question is, could you think of tying together the longitudinal data that is going to predict that poverty levels in the United States are going to rise violently over the next 5 to 10 years just because of the aging of the population, and your refugee issues, because mobilizing human capital, both bringing immigrants in and probably retiring some people to places where healthcare is a lot cheaper and the climate is warmer in Central America, may be a very useful, intelligent exchange, even if it sounds politically incorrect.
So and I'm interested in, so there's one of the sort of dirty little secrets of the United Nations and UNHCR is that they actually do have a significant amount of data that anticipates where emerging refugee crises are going to be around the world. And we don't talk about them because it freaks people out and it destabilizes markets and political regimes. So the reason that people were surprised is not necessarily because the data wasn't there, because I think there is, predictive capacity for what economies are going to do, and whatever, within certain margins of error, it's pretty accurate. But because the political systems and the economic systems are not operating at the speed of the data, or the sophistication of the data, and a lot of it has to do with the human element. We were talking at dinner last night, and I'm interested in the city stuff in particular. There are a lot of very interested, smart, progressive mayors who understand the changing dynamics of their population and are recommending policies that are long-term advantageous to the success of that city here in the United States, and then they lose their election, or the city council or whatever blocks them because the current political will doesn't exist to understand that. Perhaps the greatest thing, the most interesting thing to me that I saw from a data/political and engagement standpoint is the acceleration of the gay marriage acceptance in the United States when you compare it to other social movements. And I think a big reason for that was because it was much more strategic in terms of identifying the populations that had the potential to be persuaded, marrying that up with the political cycle, the legal cycle, et cetera, and so still letting the system play out the way the system plays out in the United States. We still needed legal protections and things like that to be created, but doing so in a way where it didn't kind of happen organically or with the whim of, whoever spends more in an election. So to me, that was an example of, I don't know if it's data sharing at a kind of nerdy data sharing level, but it was an integration of longitudinal understanding of social movements and human behavior and political behavior with real-time changing of social understanding and social appreciation of, sexual orientation in that case. And somebody, very sophisticated group, mapped out a strategy and had the patience to see it through, understanding they were going to lose the first handful of elections, they were going to lose the first handful of court cases or whatever. That model of application of data intelligence in the real world, I think, is the part that's missing. Not necessarily we lack the data to know that lots of people are going to be in poverty or lots of people are going to be subject to political blah, blah, blah. But then you take like a FiveThirtyEight, like FiveThirtyEight as a journalistic organization doesn't get the opportunity to help influence the social change before.
Right.
They are maybe better at being responsive and more intelligent and more precise. But what is going to happen in the United States politically over the next year Somebody probably predicted some aspect of this a while ago. Laura's data probably has, she's going to be like, told you so, like on like November 8th of next year, she's going to be like, should have listened to me.
Laura, do you want to jump
But
in
no
here?
one does, because it's not there like in the moment. It's not the challenge.
Yeah, boy, that's a lot of different concepts.
A lot of different stuff.
I do think that there is a lot of data available right now in different places that if brought together, it would create better insight for understanding large macro trends within the country and around the globe. I think that is true. I think that the capacity and infrastructure for bringing those data sets together in meaningful ways on a consistent basis across topics is missing. I think that it reminds me a little bit of, this is going to be a totally icky analogy, but science is scary. And I think about a few centuries ago when medical science was on the verge of important breakthroughs, and a lot of what enabled that was cadaver dissection. And before society had gotten together and sort of looked at, scary, awful, creepy, religious overtones that had all kinds of problems wrapped around it, so that it could make rules for medical doctors and medical practices and medical universities, people in the private sector, rules for how you could actually find a cadaver, use a cadaver, dissect a cadaver, and what you could do about it. Once there are rules in place, and once the society has a better understanding of what this can yield, that enables things to happen in a way where it isn't a bunch of rogue doctors or rogue data scientists running around and digging things up wherever they can find it and putting it together and seeing what they can come up with.
Those rogue data scientists. Yeah.
I know.
They're everywhere.
Not to, compare you to this, but, those doctors in those days were actually doing something amazing, and they were creating breakthroughs in little places and little ways and demonstrating what was possible. But in order for science to really advance, that had to be done in a more systemic way. And it's hard to do things in a systemic way if there aren't rules and basic infrastructure underneath it. The infrastructure, my point, is that it is being created in the private sector already.
Yes, yes.
The private sector, I think Brian is right, I think is an enormous engine for, things happening faster and with more energy and more potential imagination. And the private sector, I think, is probably willing to have rules that say you have to comport with these kinds of data sharing regimes, or you have to comport with these kinds of data privacy regimes if they're clear, consistent, that their competitors are being asked to do exactly what they're being asked to do. Then the private sector is willing to say, yeah, we would like academia and the government to have access to this data so that they can be worrying about some of these larger long-term problems where there isn't an obvious bottom line for us, but we probably know that if there was somebody working on this refugee crisis, it would probably be better for my business in the long run. And if I'm being asked to contribute to that in the same way that all my competitors are asked to contribute to that, we're in, which is, I think, Brian's point. So I think these things are possible, but I am worried about having it all happen in a completely organic way and not really engaging the society, around questions that are scary and not letting it be completely driven by the emotion that it sounds like you were encountering over dinner, which is like, I'm not letting anybody see any of my data. We've got to get a little bit past that. We can anonymize things, we can protect people in reasonable ways, and then we can allow data to be brought together. We can create infrastructure underneath the sharing of data that is enabled by the private sector, but is, also enabled by the government, and really start to get some velocity around using this stuff to solve big, big problems. So I think, boy, is that too much?
No, I think that's perfect. Let's take another question. And do try to keep it brief. We have so many things to cover.
I'm sorry, I was...
No,
do
no,
that
the
side
questions.
and then back to this side. Hi, Victoria Vrana from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. a quick tactical question for Laura, and then here, I'll stand up. And then a more general question for the panel that really builds off Laura's last comment, I think. The tactical question is, I know Catalist has information about civic engagement. Does it have information, if you can share this, about charitable giving behavior of individuals? As I was listening to Brian, if we could just share all of that information. So wondering if Catalist has that. My more general question is along the ethics and privacy lines for the social good data space. And so, again, when you think about exchanges with corporations and things like that, are there special ethical and privacy issues within the social good data space, or are there things we can just build on from the corporate space that are already there already? I feel like in the social good space, people are just beginning to think about this, and it is a little more Wild West-ish than in the corporate space.
I turn to Laura, and then I'd love for Zach and Andrew to think about how they're respectively working with this really important question. Thank you.
Yes, we do. Not just giving, but activism, and I think activism isn't in as many places because, again, it's not easily tied to a bottom line. And then I think in terms of the rules, I think that's part of the problem, that there isn't really a good set of norms for how to do this in an ethical way, in a fair way, in a sensitive way, all of those questions. And that's what this room has to figure out.
It does feel chicken egg to me because, like, I've written rules for this. I mean, I have literally, I have like 3 different versions of rules for the ways nonprofits and corporations could share data, and different magazine companies could share data across, Condé and Hearst and all of that stuff. And everyone's like, great in theory, let's see it in practice. And I'm like, great, let's just compare some data sets and we'll see how the rules apply. And they're like, nope, can't do it, need a set of rules. And I'm like, you just said we needed to test it out so we could develop rules. Like, there's no sharing going on between corporations and nonprofits, for example, in terms of that kind of stuff in any meaningful way. Like, I'll take one, because I'm pretty confident we're not going to screw it up as badly as everyone is afraid that we're going to screw it up, and then we'll get really constructive rules out of it. So, like, any corporations out there want to raise their hand and share some data with the Gates Foundation and us, and we'll sit in the middle, we'll put it in escrow, we'll let Laura do it and sign an NDA, like, whatever that takes. One frickin' example of trying to cross-collaborate between consumer and civic engagement could transform the whole conversation.
Laura, do you want to jump in?
And we keep having a lot of
I do think it is
problems.
happening. It's a little bit like what I say about, there's cadaver work going on right now. But it is a bit haphazard, and I think people are coming up with their best rules on a case-by-case basis, which slows everything down.
One university hospital bringing in a bunch of cadavers, just one, would be monumentally game-changing in terms of the conversation. Like, I agree with you. There is cadaver. We're trying to do cadaver research.
I can't believe I introduced this.
No, it's a great concept.
It's quite
We're doing one, not a whole institution, not a government mandate, not a massively funded project. Like, one, group that just tried it out, and if it failed, we all go back to our corners. I think that would be game-changing.
So, I mean, about this is like a little bit of a tangent, but I think one of the things that we've sort of been touching on a lot is just that this is hard.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I don't know if it's a great point, but I think this is
true. It happens to be true.
It happens to be. Yeah, no, this is hard, and it's also hard in a lot. There have been some good efforts on let's say a national scale towards this stuff. I mean, you look at public transit projects, right, or restaurant reviews. The voting information project, something I used to work on, right, which is connecting street segments to polling place information and ballot information, which removes personal identifiable information, right? You don't need to know who lives in a house to know that someone in that house goes to a polling place to vote. That's unbelievably hard to do, and it is built on the back of the little stained glass geography of America, each part of that participating on a standard in a key way. So that's both standard setting and its participation, and it's changing the things I was talking about before about pulling information out of old systems,
combining with Google and their capacities.
Exactly, and it could be Google. It doesn't have to be any, but it's combining with private to use them as the mouthpiece to get this information to where people are pulling from it for. So it requires everybody in this room to spend the time working between nonprofit, public, private groups and constantly pushing about why and how can we do this better.
Andrew, do you want to jump in about how you guys are thinking about this?
Data, the short answer is, Hollie said this, this is a hard problem. Data ethics is underdeveloped, understudied, and I don't have a grand strategy to fix it. I mean, this is really difficult. So a few points. One, education matters. We are at Georgetown, so I don't mean to indict Georgetown or any area of higher learning, but if academic institutions are already behind in the technical aspects they teach about data science, why would you expect them to be up to date with data ethics? So it's like if you're already using anachronistic programming languages, for example, and backward-looking approaches to data science education, why would you be at the cutting edge of data ethics? And I indict my alma mater, and I indict the whole this thing is changing so fast. So that's one point. A second point is it's not, all these conversations need to take into consideration the behavioral tendency of all of us, myself included, to choose convenience over privacy. And until you just come to realism about that and factor in the behavioral responses, the kind of opt-in, opt-out nudging that should go with all our privacy settings, you're not going to get very far. And then the last point, it's not just about anonymizing data or de-identifying data. I wrote a story a few months ago, or about a year ago, about a paper in Science and how algorithms and data scientists, algorithms developed by data scientists can essentially triangulate credit card purchase information and identify people by name from their Instagram and Facebook and other geocoding posts that are openly available. So you have these anonymized credit card purchases. You know the time. I mean, these are sold by banks and other market research companies for people to do, analysis, and supposedly it's safe. But they can find out who you are because you posted on Instagram at this specific geocoding spot, and you only need a few data points and you can identify it. So the point is, it's not just about stripping, identifying information, because the science behind cracking the codes of who people are is getting better and better.
Fantastic. We are unfortunately running out of time. I want to take 2 questions in a row and then make sure each of the panelists have a chance to respond for final words. And we'll move right into a quick coffee break so you guys can talk and continue to mingle.
So just very quickly, Adrian Gardner, I'm the FEMA Chief Information Officer. I was a long-term data architect for data.gov. I was the one that ran around the country and got the first 47 data sets. It's hard. You got to just start somewhere. And so anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. We're not where we need to be. I agree we need a lot of work in this area. My question is really around a lot of challenges that we face. We need to look for success because success has already happened. I also used to be the Weather Service CIO. If you look at weather data, all of these challenges you're talking about have been solved, folks. Example. So let's look for the examples that are out there. So if you look at weather data right now, WeatherBug, AccuWeather, guess where that data comes from? The Weather Service. People often ask, why do we need a weather service? Because that's where the data comes from. Oh, by the way, those data standards are international standards. They share data. We share data with countries that we have aggressive activities going on with, whether they be, I won't name the country, but anyway, we basically, at the end of the day, we share data because at the end of the day, weather impacts all of us. A storm comes off the tip of Africa, comes across the United States. Do I want to know about that in advance so that I can be predictive, so that I can get resources in place? I do. So there are successes out there, and we need to leverage those. So it's out there.
Next question.
I'm with the Center for Data Innovation. This actually dovetails pretty nicely with what he said. So I absolutely agree that the imagination gap exists in the federal government, but I don't think that's the primary limitation. I think there are, political realities that, agencies like NOAA cannot, even if they're the most imaginative people in the world, they just cannot publish all their data. They collect like 20 to 40 terabytes of data a day and can only afford to make 2 of those terabytes available if they want to keep the lights on. So imagination aside, how do you create channels of communication? How do you get the kind of user engagement opportunities where agencies can talk to people actually using this data to understand their problems and prioritize the release of valuable data sets when they just simply cannot afford to make it all available?
This woman, did you want to jump in with your question? you've had your hand up. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually just posted my question to Twitter too.
Oh, good. Okay. We'll check that.
Good morning, Bernice Butler from the Data Quality Campaign. Even when we're doing social good, who informs what is the social good? What are the efforts to really get input from the people we're actually trying to solve the problems from? Whether they're people who are about to retire, whether they're homeless people, or whatever the need is. Because if we're all here in this room deciding what the social good is it really what's needed, and how do you control for that?
That's a great question. And then the woman right behind you who's also had her hand up, and then we'll really turn it over to the panelists.
Thank you so much. I'll keep this quick. My name is Neda with the Open Gov Hub. I'm just curious to know if you think that engaging ordinary citizens in the process of producing and consuming the data could actually address some of the civic engagement challenges that we're all concerned about. Is citizen-generated data something that we should be looking forward to, or is there so much data already available that it makes sense to kind of train ordinary citizens to better understand information that's already out there?
Well, these are fantastic and meaty questions. So I'm just going to have the panelists go down the line and do their very best, and then we will open it up for coffee and we can continue the conversation. So, Laura.
Well, I can only say that it's clear that there's a lot of people in this room who would potentially should be on this panel. I am so grateful that this conversation is happening. We deal with one little slice of what is so massive and gigantic, and I pray every day that somewhere these conversations are happening, and if Georgetown is creating a way to have more of these conversations that are inclusive, that allow more input than just us, I think that is a terrific step in the right direction.
Okay, there's a lot in there.
In
So we may have to kick it to Twitter. But so in terms of prioritizing, one of the things I think is key is just commitment, right? Commitment from the top. That there's an element, especially when you're looking at the city's city level, right? Mayor, city manager says like this is important, and departments, if you're talking about prioritizing data sets and releasing, you have to do this, right? This is a part of our plan. In terms of defining social good, that's an amazing question. I just have some examples as a point to. So the city of Kansas City, Missouri, they model their strategic business plan in part on a citizen survey they do on a regular basis, right? So it's constantly like, tell us how you feel, and then we're going to build that into how we're prioritizing that. Oh, and by the way, we're gonna set goals, and we're gonna make market improvement towards those goals, and we're gonna show you the data that we're doing to memorize it. So that's sort of engaging the citizen base in that whole process. And then in terms of the engaging citizen base on top of that, I absolutely think there's some amazing opportunities to do so in both the creation or co-creation of data around this. And look at sort of Philadelphia, their open data portal, for example, is not just, it's where the city puts all their data, but it's not just the city's data, it's as many of the nonprofit community that they can, as well as the citizen-based data. And there's some incredible things that come out of that. Louisville, Kentucky, for example, they had a really interesting program which was with a partnership between the city and a local organization where they put air quality sensors on bikes and gave the city the information they needed to better track pollution issues in the city and what neighborhoods were being most predominantly affected and how that related to the weather. So it gave them the information they needed to act, and that was really citizen-collected data working in partnership with the city.
That's very cool. So let me make a point and give an example to hopefully address these 4 problems. The point I want to make, actually, I want to end on a positive note, is that it's actually getting better, and there's a lot of success stories. So if we're talking about data for social good, there's been a lot of uses of data for social good in the last 5 to 10 years, or even just the last 2 years. It's just getting better and better. Now, what example I want to give you to make this point, I think touches on all 4 issues. It involves the killing of Americans by police. The FBI OCR data, the crime report data, the Bureau of Justice Statistics data is terrible. It's shitty. I'm going to be honest. It's appalling. It's embarrassing for this country that we have such poor data on who officers kill, how they kill them, particularly for minority communities. This is it's a tragedy. Well, it's getting better. who started this? To get to your point about, but your 2 points about what is the social good and what about citizens being involved with data collection, the Guardian US partnered with this organization, The Counted, that started to actually cull police reports to the extent they existed, or newspaper clippings, and created a database of killings by police officer killings in the United States. Well, public pressure is growing on this issue after Ferguson and Eric Gardner, et cetera, and the FBI is responding. To get at your issue about how hard and difficult this is, you want to talk about a politically charged issue. The FBI, bless their heart, like, what are they going to do? They have to aggregate all this information across the U.S. and publicly put it out there and have people's careers on the line. This is tricky and it's hard, but guess what? There's a fire lit under them now by these citizen-created websites, databases that are working with other journalism organizations to kind of create an actual data set that's addressing an issue that wasn't thought of as a social good for a long time. I'm actually optimistic. I see a lot of progress here, both in the government, data.gov. Things have gotten a lot better with city and federal governments releasing data. It's getting a lot better. And the citizen involvement in the journalism community, I'm proud to be a part of that, but like even beyond us, has gotten a lot better at telling important stories for all types of communities. So I think you should also congratulate yourself.
So here's the thing. I am optimistic and a general believer that human beings, and particularly those in a relatively functioning democracy, will figure things out if given the opportunity to do so. And so the caution that I would put on this whole conversation is defining success or defining social good in a way that does not actually allow for the system as a whole to function in the ways that it's sort of organically going to do it. I realize it seems blasphemous, but I would almost rename this conversation, not data for social good, but like data period because period. Like we have data, we have the capacity to be smarter about all sorts of things. I have confidence that the ways that we would use greater data intelligence would be advantageous for people as a whole. But even there, I would go, that's not good enough. Like the concept that I have and the concept that I try to hold, everything that I work to is the idea of 100% participation. And everyone's sort of like, ha ha ha, 100% participation. Like, that's ridiculous. What would happen if 100% of people who are eligible to vote actually voted? We have no earthly idea. We've never come anywhere close. And like, we blame all of our problems on a lack of participation. What if that's not actually the problem that we should be solving? So why don't we solve for every problem with this ridiculously high standard, shoot for the stars, land on the moon. Right now we're shooting for like just outside the atmosphere and we're landing like on the 14th floor of some building, and it's not really exciting enough to me. So, perfect is the enemy of good. Like, we need to just do things, right? To Laura's point, I agree. We need standards and protocols and rules to do this stuff. We don't need ratified by 50 states, everybody agrees, signs on the bottom line, all corporations are on board. We need rules so that we can then figure out that the rules aren't good enough, go and do the next set of rules and the next set of rules. Like, we're a democracy. This is how this system works. If you haven't seen Hamilton, go see Hamilton, because they do it in a like really cool hip hop sort of way where you figured this out, a long time ago. So to me, what it ultimately comes down to is we have to redefine what success means. In nonprofit and in everything else, success is about storytelling. Storytelling is bullshit. Storytelling doesn't actually demonstrate success. Success is completing whatever it is we set out to do. So I've worked in hunger. I think the goal for hunger is 0 people who are food insecure. Feeding more people in the country is not an equivalent measure to 0 food insecurity. We're not even reversing the trajectory. We're just excited that maybe that hunger's not increasing at the same rate as economic inequality. Like, woo, what are we celebrating? Like, success would be 0 cop shootings, because there shouldn't be people shooting each other. Like, not fewer cop shootings or more justified cop shootings, like 0. So let's change the success and keep that as the standard for ways in which to use data to inform what it is we're trying to do. I'm not saying it's realistic. I'm just saying, stop saying, if we got 2% more people to vote, everything would be fixed. Go for 100%. Maybe eventually we'll get there. But even if we don't, we're going to change a bunch of different problems than the ones that I think we're trying to change now, which I would argue are probably not necessarily, in most cases, the right problems.
That's fantastic. Well, big round of applause for our panel.